Thank you, Robin. This is Jim Levitt. I am the director of ALPINE, the director of the ILCN, and today am so glad to be introducing our interlocutors and our honored guest, Jane Difley. Interviewing Jane will be Henry Tepper, who is a conservation consultant and leader of many organizations in New England and Eastern New York over the past 30 years. And Frank Lowenstein, who is the Chief Operating Officer of the New England Forestry Foundation. They will be addressing the topics that Jane brought up in her Kingsbury Browne Fellowship. She wrote a paper called Standing Tall, Forestry Practices on Lands Conserved by New England Land Trusts. The paper itself has been distributed in the invitations. And if you need a further copy of it, please feel free to contact us at the Lincoln Institute. My email is jlevitt@lincolninst.edu, but the best person to contact is Robin, and her email is on the Robin Austin, R. Austin, AUSTIN, @lincolninst.edu. So with that, with no further ado, let me introduce Henry Tepper, who will take us right into the subject at hand. Henry.
Thank you, Jim and Marion, and welcome everyone to our webinar with Jane Difley, the Land Trust Alliance's 2020 Kingsbury Browne Fellow. It's an honor for Frank Lowenstein and me to moderate this event with my friend and colleague, Jane Difley. And when we were preparing for the webinar, I reflected on my relationship with Jane, and I realized that we've known each other for 25 years. I met Jane in 1996 when I was the new state director of the Nature Conservancy's New Hampshire chapter, and Jane was the brand new president and forester at the New Hampshire Forest Society. And at that time, the relationship between the Nature Conservancy and the Forest Society was, frankly, pretty rocky. The previous leadership of the Forest Society basically believed that there was only room for one major conservation organization in the Granite State. And let's just say that I wasn't exactly welcomed with open arms when I arrived to run the Conservancy's chapter there. But all that changed when Jane became the head of the Forest Society. Jane was smart, secure, and completely comfortable in her own skin. And from the moment she joined the Forest Society, she was unfailingly welcoming and gracious and generous to me and my colleagues at the Conservancy. She recognized fully that our two organizations had different missions and approaches, but that we were both strongly committed to conservation and that we could coexist and thrive. And that's exactly what we did. The Forest Society and TNC New Hampshire did have their differences, but Jane and I became close friends and colleagues, and I'll never forget the dignity and respect that she treated me with. Jane is a person of enormous integrity and intelligence and accomplishment. I can't think of anyone who more richly deserves the Kingsbury Browne Fellowship. Those are all the nice things I want to say about Jane. And I just want to start now I'll kick things off with a question. Jane, welcome. I want to start by asking you about your Kingsbury Browne paper. Could you tell us why you chose the topic and provide us with a brief summary of its contents? And what were some of the insights that you gained from writing it?
Thanks, Henry, and thank you for such a nice introduction. I'm not sure it's all quite deserved, but I was always very sad when you left New Hampshire. And thank you also, Frank, for participating with us. I need to really start by thanking the Land Trust Alliance for the Kingsbury Browne Conservation Leadership Award. It came immediately after I had retired from the Forest Society in 2019. And I also want to thank the Lincoln Institute for the fellowship, which allowed me to pursue this paper, and also were incredibly helpful in editing it, giving me some suggestions, helping out in so many different ways. I'm very grateful. And I'm also grateful to the land trusts whom I interviewed, who were so willing to give of their time and their expertise It was really fun to deal with them, and I want to thank them for their help. So when I learned I had this fellowship and that I was going to be writing a paper, I was a little nervous about that. I'm not a researcher, I'm a practitioner. But I thought, gee, I'm retiring. It would be really fun to go visit some of my land trust colleagues throughout New England, go on some of their lands, kick the duff with them, talk about forestry, what their organizations were doing, be in the woods and visit with them. And of course, the COVID pandemic put all of that to rest. I wasn't going to be able to visit. I wasn't going to be able to travel. So instead, I sent a sort of a list of questionnaires to land trusts, and 17 land trust leaders replied, and I interviewed them, and they formed the basis for this paper. And in addition, I looked at their websites for further information. And what I really wanted to do was talk about forestry. I have a master's degree in forestry. I'm a forester, licensed forester in the state of New Hampshire. And I wanted to know how land trusts in New England approached forestry, particularly on the lands that they own, but also a little bit on the easements that they hold. And I chose land trusts. The choice was not random, but I chose land trusts from different states of different sizes, some that I knew did not practice forestry, some that I knew forestry was basic to their organizations. So I thought I had a good representation of large and small, different geographies and different kinds of organizations. And so one of the things that I found was that I found interesting was that even the organizations that did not practice forestry, I should stop here for one moment, which is one of the things I did find out in these interviews is that land trust folks, like many people, conflate forestry with harvesting. And when I talk about forestry, I'm not talking about harvesting is one of the tools that's used in practicing forestry, but it's a tool. It's not the same thing as forestry. Forestry includes, locating boundaries, doing inventories of natural resources, examining waterways, protecting wildlife habitat. It's a really broad, applicable science that it sometimes uses harvesting to achieve the landowner's objectives. So I just want to put that out so that you understand what I'm talking about when I talk about forestry. So the land trusts, I found that the land trusts that didn't practice forestry on the lands that they owned didn't practice forestry for really reasons related to their mission and related to the kinds of lands that they own. For example, the Squam Lakes Conservation Organization, I'm getting the name of it wrong, their lands tend to be small. They're to protect the watershed of Squam Lake and really don't lend themselves to practicing forestry. But their conservation easements, in fact, allow and in some cases encourage the practice of forestry. And I found that over and over again, that land trusts allowed or encouraged forestry in many of their easements, even if they didn't practice forestry on the lands that they held. And of course, the Forest Society, the Society for the Protection of the New Hampshire Forest, at its core is forestry. Its mission statement is to perpetuate the forests of New Hampshire by their wise use and their complete reservation in places of special scenic beauty. That's their mission statement from 1904, and it still guides the organization with this notion of responsible use of natural resources and what we might call today natural areas or wilderness protections, that they're two sides of the same coin. And so it was really interesting to me that even the land trusts that didn't practice forestry understood that forestry had a long tradition in New England, that it often was important to landowners, that it had economic as well as ecological implications, and that it was really an accepted practice in their areas of service. it's also true, and I'm sure this comes as no surprise, that these days you really can't talk about forestry or about forests without having climate and climate change come up in the conversation. And while climate change was not the basis for my research, if you will, I knew that we couldn't talk about forestry without talking about climate to some extent. And it was very interesting to me that all of the organizations I spoke with are really engaged in talking about climate, considering what their role should be in natural climate solutions, discussing with their boards and with scientists and with foresters to learn more about the possibilities. Some land trusts are deeply engaged in climate projects, both in the California market and in the voluntary market. Some have been engaged in aggregations of landowners for climate mitigation. There's quite a spectrum of how land trusts are engaged, but they are all deeply engaged in thinking about climate. It's influencing the criteria they use when they accept land or conservation easements. And they're very much thinking about and talking about, if not already engaged in changing the way they're managing lands in an effort to mitigate climate. I also made some, I think that especially in the carbon markets, the California markets, for example, there are many organizations and many landowners who find the length of time commitment, the cost, the length of time it takes to do a project are really prohibitive from them, at least at this point, to entering those markets. But that doesn't mean that land trusts and landowners, that there aren't things that they can do that are helpful in terms of mitigating climate. The only thing is they perhaps don't know the exact quantity of carbon they're storing. And so I made some recommendations in the paper. One of them is just the most basic and perhaps the most important, is that we need to keep forests as forests. And that's something that obviously land trusts in New England in particular are very much engaged in. I think the second thing is that we all have an opportunity to keep abreast of new science and to improve the sustainable forestry practices that we're practicing, and to demonstrate those practices to the landowners that we have influence over and on whose lands we have conservation easements. And I think we have an obligation in this part of the country also to demonstrate and encourage other landowners to also think about climate, think about forestry, and think about those kinds of practices. There's one other thing I'll say before, and then I'll be quiet for a moment, which is that the folks that I talk to from land trusts, and I know that this is true of many individuals, there's some confusion out there about the difference between the rate of sequestration and carbon storage. And they're not the same thing, although obviously they're related. And you know, while without getting into the weeds about the science, because I am not, that's not my expertise, but you know, large old growth forests store a lot of carbon. Sometimes, depending on where you are, what part of the country, all kinds of depends on this, depends on that. The rate of sequestration can be faster in forests that are younger or that are managed. So I just want to raise that issue, that there is this difference between the rate of sequestration and carbon storage. And I think that I probably said too much.
I think that
You're muted,
was
Henry.
Not at all.
So Jane, you've had a truly distinguished career, an extensive career, that's really bridged two communities, the forestry community and the land trust community. You've been incredibly active in both of those. And so I wanted to ask you just to reflect a little bit on how those communities, and particularly the forestry community, because I think that's less familiar to the land trust community, how those have changed during your career. And then how you think the forestry and land trust movements might interact to better serve a diverse public.
So you're just trying to age me, that's all. You know, when I first sort of was thinking about this question, the first thing I thought about was that fairly early in my career, there was this, in forestry, there was this evolving concept from the Pacific Northwest called New Forestry. And it was largely attributed to a professor called Jerry Franklin. And he was sort of the father of the new forestry. And it was really the beginning, perhaps, of an awareness that both economic and ecological concepts were important in the practice of forestry. And you know, that led to the plan for the spotted owl. This really does date me. This is years and years ago. But you know, that conversation and that science has influenced how forestry has been practiced throughout the country, I think. And that was an early change in my career. I would also say that when I graduated from the University of Massachusetts, I was not in the first wave of women foresters. I was probably in the second or so. But in 1975, when there was a conference on women and natural resources in Dallas, Texas, I knew all the women in the United States who practiced forestry. And I am proud to say and happy to say that that is no longer true. And that has been, I think, a big change in the field. I hope that we have had an influence, and I'll talk about that a little bit later with one person in particular. But that's a huge change, both in the dynamics of the profession, but also perhaps for some in the approach to forestry. You know, that foresters aren't loggers, they're foresters. And so I found that interesting. Another big thing that I think happened during my career is that, and we saw this play out in New England, that the large industrial forests that were connected to mills, the lands that they owned and the mills were separated. And there were different owners for the mills and different owners for the lands. And that was millions of acres, especially across Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. And that led to a lot of changes. It led to the growth of what we call TIMOs, Timber Investment Management Organizations, which were investing in the lands that had formerly been industrial lands. It was a different approach to forestry because they were interested in investment, not in supplying a mill. And it also, I think, led to great opportunities for land trusts as there were changes in ownership from industry to TIMOs. And then when the TIMOs were of a limited period of time, when that investment period was up, that was another, land trust had another crack at protecting those lands with conservation easements. So I think there's been a huge change during my career in land ownership patterns across New England. There's also been a huge growth in the number and kinds of land trusts in New England. I remember the first Land Trust Alliance national rally that I went to. I loved it. The energy was so different from going to a forestry convention. There were lots more women. There were lots and lots of volunteers who were board members of land trusts. And that growing community of people who cared about land protection and the environment was just so exciting to me and has just grown over the years. I'm very fortunate to have been involved in both of these communities, of being, I've never had just a job. I've had kind of a calling to be a forester, to be involved in land protection. I'm so grateful for that and have enjoyed being in both of those communities and feel very lucky about that. Another thing I think was the Forest Legacy Program, which sort of came about at the same time as the change in land ownerships. The Forest Legacy Program is federally funded, and originally it was intended for working forests. The money was federal, but it transferred conservation easements to states. And that again got land trusts involved, because land trusts really knew how to do these transfers of rights, and the states at the beginning didn't have people on their staffs who really knew how to do that. And so the staffs of states and land trusts worked together to make these forest legacy programs, projects happen, and protected millions of acres of land, and still are in New England and throughout the country. And then I think the final thing I'll mention is that the evolution of our digital age, and in particular, I would mention geographic information systems mapping, has not only allowed us to map and see things in layers and put information together that was much more difficult to do before GIS was really well developed. It's not only allowed foresters and people in land trusts to have tools that help them, but it's also given us new tools to communicate with people and to demonstrate to them where things are happening, how things are happening, to help people envision what's possible. And I think that GIS could be accredited with being sort of evolving at the same time as these efforts to protect landscapes across, say, the Quabbin to Cardigan effort in New Hampshire and Massachusetts, which goes across state lands, the wildlands and woodlands efforts, and many other efforts across the region that involve landscapes where we can identify the most important lands to be protected. So it's been a great tool for both the forestry profession and also for land trusts. So I think those things have been some of the big changes during my career. And, you know, I think we're in the midst of, there's lots of other digital things that are occurring that I'm not even aware of that are helping us both as land trusts and as foresters.
Jane, that was such an insightful answer. I just took a few notes, and you know, the way you just wove together the changes in the forestry profession, the changes in the financial structure of the forest industry, the growth of land trusts as a movement, and the power of them with federal programs like the Forest Legacy Program and the growth of funding, and but simultaneously the growth of vision, partially enabled by technology like GIS. That's such a helpful perspective. Just a little bit, I'm going to ask for a little bit of follow-up. Do you think there's more in terms of the interaction between the forestry community and the land trust community? What sort of additional bridges or frames do you think would be helpful to sort of advancing the practice of both land conservation and forestry?
So, you know, in talking to the land trusts that I spoke with, there are a couple in particular that sort of pointed out to me what's possible when land trusts and foresters are talking together. And just to talk about a couple, the Upper Valley Land Trust has been working very closely with more than one forester to really dive deep into what natural climate solutions, and in particular forestry, might mean for the way they think about natural climate solutions and forestry. And Jeannie McIntyre is just, and her organization, they're just doing a really amazing, they're spending a lot of time and diving very deeply to understand forestry, which is not sort of their basic basic to their organization, but is something that they've acknowledged as a use, a legitimate land use. And so I think having a forester, or in their case, foresters, they dealt with one forester who was perhaps on the more ecological side, and another forester who might have been more on the economic side, so that they really looked at the different perspectives about forestry and what that means for the work that they do. So I would say that working with a forester is good for the forester and the forestry profession to learn more about what land trusts and landowners who have conservation easements, what their concerns are. And it's great for the land trust because they learn more about forestry. Another one that I'll mention is that I found interesting. I just found a tick on the back of my neck. This is the forester, you know, is the Kennebec Land Trust in Maine, which is a small local or county land trust that at one point was really not interested in practicing forestry on their lands. But they started to work with a forester, with Ken Loston, and they too came to see that practicing forestry was an important way to keep wood more local, sort of like local farming, and also to keep the carbon in their local area, that when you use wood for tables and houses and construction, it's still storing carbon and you can grow more forests. They got interested in good forestry, and they changed their perspective as a land trust because they were working very closely with a forester. So I think there's much to be gained by that, by foresters and land trusts working together. And I think that goes in both directions. I also think, this is a personal opinion, that I think that the Land Trust Alliance has been a little, I'm not sure what the right word is, but a little skittish about forestry, because many of the land trusts in the United States, they're either not, they don't have forested lands around them, say in the Midwest. They're farm land trusts. They're a little skittish about sort of, I think, promoting forestry too much. And I think that they could be useful in convening those land trusts that, and I know they're doing some work with, a lot of work with carbon, but convening those land trusts who want to learn more about forestry and helping them with a roadmap in terms of not only forestry, but also in terms of climate.
Great. That was another amazing answer. And interestingly, both Ken Loston and Teresa Kirshner are here on the webinar. So nice to acknowledge the importance of that relationship and the work that Kennebec Valley Land Trust has been doing. As moving on a little bit and talking, building on that sort of question that you raised at the end there, how do you think we should balance society's need to protect more wilderness with society's need also for a continuing stream of renewable materials like wood products? And how does the climate crisis and the need to remove carbon from the atmosphere, while also, you know, again, having renewable raw materials for the economy, how does that affect your sense of the balance?
So I think this is a question that we're going to be debating for a long time. And I think that's a healthy thing. As I said earlier, the Forest Society's mission statement was both about responsible use of natural resources and preservation of forests, both. And the Forest Society has always seen those as two sides of the same coin. But over time, how that gets implemented, I think has evolved. So, you know, I think one of the things that I've been impressed with is this notion, and Frank, you know more about this than I do, but that NEF and also the Kennebec Land Trust have promoted, is that we need to think about a larger system. we need to not just think about the forest, but we also need to think about how is the wood used once it's harvested from forests. And if forests are managed sustainably and the wood is used in construction and in buildings, the carbon is being stored and the forest can grow, more, can grow more trees and can store more carbon. And I think looking at that larger system is something that we need to spend more time on. I think that over my career, I've come more and more to the idea that we do need to be protecting more land as natural areas or wilderness, or however we want to call it. But I think we also have to understand that we don't know what it will be like 100 years from now. And when we talk about natural areas or wilderness, does that mean we won't do anything about invasive species that invade natural areas or wilderness areas? What do we do about fire? What do we do? I mean, there's a lot of questions about what we know about the future in reserving lands to be untouched. At the same time, as scientific refugia and as places where we can study nature that's not tampered with, I think natural areas are really important, especially in a place like New England that is so heavily, much of which is so heavily populated. So I think I don't have an answer to that, is what I'm saying, Frank. I'm fudging the question because I don't know the answer, but I think it is incredibly important to have both managed lands where we can harvest locally used wood and also wilderness areas. And I say in the paper, David Kittredge was a friend of mine and a supporter, and I really admired all the work that he did at the University of Massachusetts. He wrote a paper with a couple other people that was The Illusion of Preservation, which was about how in New England or in this country where we have good environmental laws, it might be better for us to do harvesting here than to not allow harvesting, protect all this land and have our natural resources that we need and use in this country come from other countries where the environmental protections are less stringent than they are here. And I think that's a notion that I keep in the back of my head as I think about these things.
Yeah, I personally still go back and reread The Illusion of Preservation at least once every year or two. That's a wonderful paper. And worth noting that the lead author was a young woman, an undergraduate student who was a student of David's, and that David Foster, who's also on the call, was another co-author of that paper.
Jane, I'm going to switch gears and ask a question. And I noticed that one of the people attending the webinars who's written in a question asked a similar question. So we're on the same wavelength. But this is going to sort of switch directions. In conversations that we had with you while we were preparing for the webinar, you talked more than once about your admiration for the forester and academic and writer Suzanne Simard, who's just released her memoir, Finding the Mother Tree. And by the way, for those of you who haven't listened to the recent interview with Suzanne that was on Fresh Air, it's really interesting, and I suggest you do. I'd just like you to offer your thoughts on how Suzanne's thinking has influenced you and how you think it might influence forestry in the future.
Yeah. So I don't know Suzanne Simard, and I've just gotten her book, which came out a couple days ago. So I haven't read it. I've seen her TED Talks. So first of all, I'm really impressed with her. She's a professor at the University of British Columbia. And she, early in her career, made some observations that led to her research that fundamentally could change how we think about forests, or at least how foresters think about forestry. So foresters think about forests as as trees, as being in competition with one another. That the more space and light and water you give to a tree, the better it's going to grow, the happier it's going to be, etc. But Suzanne noticed that when trees grew together, and she happened to be in a Douglas fir ecosystem with birch, that the Douglas fir grew better, was healthier, happier, grew faster, when there was also birch in the mix. And she discovered that it's because all the trees in a forest are connected by mycelium around the roots of the trees, and that through these fungi, these mycelium, the trees actually communicate, and they share carbon, they share information, and of course, as a woman, her research was poo-pooed. You know, it was considered silly or woo-woo or whatever. And over time, she persisted, and her work has been replicated and is now being accepted by scientists and foresters. And so her notion is that trees actually collaborate, and they're not in competition. And I think that gives, and also it gives this sense of a forest as being an organism. You know, it's kind of a different way to look at it. It's an organism. And so I think she really has challenged some underlying concepts of how we look at forests and how we think about forestry. Now, her research is all out in the West, and it may sort of express itself differently here in the Northeast, but I think it's just really interesting work that points out to all of us that none of us know everything, and that science is ongoing, that we need to pay attention to science, that new knowledge will help us to do things differently and will help us to think about things differently. And I think that will be true both for land trusts and also for the forestry community. Read Suzanne Simard.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I thought that, I mean, I know a little bit about her, not a lot, and I thought that both I thought the recent interview was fantastic, and so look forward to reading her book. I mean, it is seriously profound stuff on a lot of different levels. We're going to ask one more question, and then maybe we'll open it up and relay some of the questions that have been posted already, and encourage those of you who have a question and haven't written it, please do, and we'll try to get to some of them. Certainly not all of them. There are a lot, but we'll get to some of them. So I know you don't like to sort of reflect personally on your accomplishments. You're too modest for that, but I'll put you on the spot just a little bit. When you look back on your career, you think about when you just started out. I mean, this is sort of the standard question, but I think it's relevant here given the arc of your career. What kind of advice do you wish you had gotten when you were just starting out? What do you wish you had known? What were hard lessons that you might have that you had to learn that it would have been useful to have somebody to have tipped you off when you started, maybe both as a leader and as a forester? And then similarly, what kind of advice would you offer young conservationists who are starting out now?
So some of you who know me might know that earlier in my career, I wasn't really great at taking advice. So advice that was offered might not have been taken. I wish I had a better sense when I was younger of being a little more diplomatic, and I learned along the way, or at least I've tried. I think it's really important. I'm not sure that anyone ever told me, but I did it anyway, to pursue things that I loved doing. that to pursue things that I cared about. And I did. And obviously I care deeply about forestry and I care deeply about land protection. And as a result, you know, I've had this career that has been incredibly rewarding to me, and I hope has made a difference in the worlds in which I have worked. So I think I would tell younger people that do things that you love and the rest will follow. I think the other thing is that I was often told that I should have a career plan. And I was often asked at job interviews, you know, where do you want to be in 5 years? Or where do you want to be in 10 years? And I never knew. I always did. I feel like I always did whatever the next thing was. The next thing would come and I would make choices about it. And that's always served me well, to do the next thing, whatever that was. You know, I think I would tell younger people entering their careers that if you're involved in forestry or if you're involved in being in a land trust, that you are the envy of every desk-bound peer that you know, and that stay with it because it's a rewarding, it's not just a rewarding career, it's a rewarding life.
Absolutely.
Great. So Jane, we have some wonderful questions in the Q&A. I want to start with one from Thomas McHenry, who points out that, and I'm going to paraphrase a bit, New England is very heavily forested today, northern New England especially, but even southern New England is 60% or more forested. And the economic returns from forest management are not great. They're 2 to 3% per year, which, as McHenry says, Thomas McHenry says, barely covers the taxes and minimal improvements. So, you know, you're better off putting your money almost anywhere else, stock market, you know, commercial real estate, you name it. So given that, what do you see as the future and the frame that makes sense for forest land ownership in New England?
So I think this is a real question. It's related to something I said earlier about the change in land ownership in the forest industry. And the returns for landowners, I think, are difficult these days because there's no place for low-grade wood to go if you're looking to improve your forest. And that used to be one way that people would pay the taxes. So for large landowners, I don't think I have an answer for large landowners. For family landowners, I don't think family landowners usually own their land. I think Forest Service, their research has shown that family landowners don't own their land just for an investment. They own it for recreation. They own it because they want to be out in the forest. They own it for wildlife. They own it for all kinds of reasons. And while it's true that having some return better than 2 or 3% is helpful in them being able to keep their forests as forests, I think for most of them, it's not just about the return on the investment. I really don't think I have an answer. And I think a lot of people are thinking about what new industries that make sense could be brought to New England that could help bolster the return on investment for those landowners that are investment oriented. Things like mass timber, which is the new sort of thinking about being able to use wood for larger buildings than formerly could be engineered, uses for other parts, other things. So I don't have a good answer for that. It really is a serious question that concerns foresters in particular at this point, and many landowners.
I'm going to I'm going to switch gears first. I mean, I'm going to ask a different question that I had planned on, just to follow up on that, Jane, and then a different question. Someone who has asked this question anonymously noted that many southeastern forests are being used to create wood pellets for fuel consumption overseas, and wondering what your thoughts are about that practice.
I think it's stupid. You know, if you look at the energy costs of harvesting and making either chips or pellets and then shipping them, you know, across the Atlantic Ocean, the energy equation just doesn't work. I shouldn't comment on southern forestry because I don't, I'm not an expert on that. I think the South, trees grow really fast there, and they have quite a long tradition of kind of mowing and growing vast acreages of plantations. So I don't think that's a really great idea. I think one of the issues with what's going on in southeastern, the southeastern part of the state, is that it's being used to discourage the use of chips and pellets in New England. And it's a completely different sort of frame. You know, the pellets that are being manufactured in New England are not being shipped overseas, number one. Number two, they're not doing vast, you know, clear cutting in order to make pellets, number two. And it's a much smaller industry here. So I think, you know, I remember when rainforests were used, they, you know, talking about cutting trees in the rainforest. This is a long time ago in my career, and applying that to New England forests. They're completely different forests. The soils are completely different. How they operate as an ecological entity are completely different. And yet Brazilian rainforests were being used to halt forestry in New England. I think this has the sort of markings of that that same thing, that we don't recognize that forests are different in different parts of the country and in different parts of the world. Yeah.
I'm going to ask a question I had planned on asking, which comes from Bill Labick. Hi, Bill.
Hi, Bill.
Glad you're here. And Bill asks, within the new climate change reality, how does comprehensive regional planning provide a helpful context to both forestry and land protection?
Oh, good question. One of the things I think is that we're going to be in a long period of conversation and discussion about what's the best thing to do about forests in terms of climate and in terms of mitigating climate. And we know that there are these conversations about complete protection and conversations about how forestry, the practice of forestry and harvesting, can be useful. But if we go, as we found in terms of land protection and providing wildlife corridors and those kinds of things, you know, having just a piece of land here and a piece of land there doesn't add up to the same kind of thing if we have connected pieces of land that are protected, where there are perhaps carbon projects by multiple landowners. I think that we need to think more collectively about landscapes, as we have been doing, but in a deeper context, both about not just protecting the land and about wildlife and water quality, but also about climate. So I don't know that I have a specific answer, but I think the groundwork that's been done on these plans and on protecting larger landscapes is really important as a basis for talking about climate mitigation.
Great. Jane, Teresa Kirshner has a question for us, which relates to sort of current public policy. The Biden administration has endorsed the 30 by 30 goal of protecting 30% of the landscape by 2030. And, you know, there's a focus there on working with private landowners. What do you think are the most likely and most realistic sources of funding for small land trusts for projects that will help make that vision a reality?
Hi, Teresa. Good question. I'm not sure. I think we all need to be creative about how to fund land protection projects. You know, we've depended a lot on private donors and on foundations, on state monies and on federal monies. I think we all can be grateful for the Land and Water Conservation Fund and its funding in the last legislative session. I think there is work being done on other ways to invest in land that which are over my head in terms of finances. You know, organizations like the Conservation Fund and the Trust for Public Land think about those kinds of things on a daily basis. So I guess I don't have a great answer. I think that's something that every land trust struggles with, Teresa. And I know at the Forest Society, we were always piecing together monies from different plots of land and appealing to people who cared about the land in their backyard or in their community or in their state. And I think for the foreseeable future, we'll be doing that.
Jane, I'm going to change the way somebody asked a question to just broaden it a little bit. Robert Hatch asked about the current rates of deforestation in New England and the country. And I know that there's been a fair amount of discussion about how the reforestation of New England has now changed. This steady increase for the better part of a century has now changed. I'm wondering if you have thoughts about that, about how this situation has changed both regionally and nationally.
So I really don't have expertise nationally. But in New England, I think one of the important things for us to be thinking about goes beyond just protecting land, which is the thing that land trusts think about most. I think we need to be thinking about perhaps, you know, how do we work with regional planning agencies as growth occurs around our cities and in suburbs? How do land trusts get more involved in not just protecting land, but also supporting, if it's good planning? I'm not sure what that's exactly the answer, but so that there's going to be growth and we can't prevent that. It's un-American, I guess. But can we encourage growth to happen in the places where it makes the most sense and encourage land protection in the most crucial places for protecting ecosystems, water, wildlife habitat, etc. I think the other thing that we have not touched on during this time is the whole concept of land ownership. And I understand there's a book out called Land by Winchester that I think calls into question our notion that was brought over here by our forebears of private land ownership. And there's an article, again, that I haven't quite yet read in the Atlantic about turning the national parks back over to the tribes. So one of the things that I think is worth us thinking about is, does our current model of land ownership really work across New England to protect those things that best need protecting and serve the needs at the same time of people? Because we need to do both. We need to serve the needs of people and we need to protect those ecosystems that are the most important.
Henry, let me ask you all to do one or two more questions and then we will close out. This has been a very good session.
Yeah, so Jane, you made a brief reference to this early in your remarks, and I want to just see if you want to expand on it a little bit. Michelle Gerard has asked, can you help people understand the difference between carbon sequestration and carbon storage, and how that relates, of course, to decisions about forests and forestry?
So I'm not an expert in this area, but as I understand it, when you talk about sequestration, you're talking about the rate at which carbon is absorbed by growing plants, and in particular trees. So it's a rate. And often younger trees, not always, but often younger trees absorb carbon at a faster rate than older, larger trees. On the other hand, the carbon that's already stored in large trees, often older trees, is much larger than the amount of, so it's a rate versus an amount. So the rate of smaller, younger trees, they are storing carbon faster, as I understand it, in many cases, but they don't store as much because they're younger, they're smaller, etc. So on the one hand, we might want to protect old growth forests where there's lots of stored carbon and keep it stored. And there might be other forests where it's appropriate to harvest trees so that the younger trees, so that we take the stored carbon off the landscape and keep using it so the carbon continues to be stored. And the younger trees then grow and are again rapidly storing carbon. And so I think it's one of those pieces of information that helps us think about, is this a place where we want to allow harvesting? If we want to harvest here, how much harvesting do we want to do? And what does that mean about the rate of carbon absorption? I think those are questions. They're not answers, they're questions to help us consider the decisions that we're making.
Great. I think we maybe have time for one more question. And I'm going to make it one that I think you'll have a short answer to. And that is, I wonder if you have any thoughts about the public messaging associated with the importance of forests and forestry, how the public messaging around forests and forest management should change.
You know, I spent 23 years studying not just forestry, but not just trees, but family trees, because I was doing development for the Forest Society. And one of the things that's really important about doing development is to listen. And I think that we often, when we're talking about forestry, and sometimes even when we're talking about land protection, we don't listen enough to the individuals, the communities, the people whom we most want to communicate with. And so it's, you know, I think there's a lot of listening that we still have to do. And I think we have to listen again and again. And we need to remember that listening is an important part of the communication, and perhaps more important than the message.
That is a great way to close. I want to thank Henry and Frank for doing an expert job at carrying this conversation along. I think we really got a great view into Jane's vast amount of experience. I also want to thank Marianne Jorgensen, who is the project manager for ALPINE and who worked very hard to make sure that all the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed for this webinar. Marianne, you did a great job on this.
Yeah.
I want to thank Robin Austin, who has very quietly and patiently made sure that all the tech has been without any fault. Robin, thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. Of course, most of all, I want to thank, and I want to pass on to Jane a compliment she just gave to someone. You were describing Suzanne Simard, who used the wonderful phrase, very popular today, over time, she persisted. Well, Jane Difley, you may not have agreed with everybody right at the beginning of your career, as you said yourself. And you also have made a tremendous number of friends in New England and across the United States in your chosen field of endeavors. So thank you for over time persisting. You are really a treasure, and we so appreciate your time here today. So
Thank you, Jim.
you're welcome. So thank you to everyone who attended. Again, Henry and Frank, thank you for doing such a great job, and we will be back with another Alpine session sometime probably in the fall, and we look forward to continuing this discussion for many years to come.
Thank
Good
you,
afternoon,
Jim.
everybody.
Thanks, Marianne. And thanks, everybody, for your great questions.
And
Yeah,
thank you,
thank
Jane,
you.
for your great answers. Those were so fascinating.